Church History, Session 2. We left Session 1 with a question. I'll go ahead and repeat it because what I realized was when I thought about the question, usually I think things in my head and they sound awesome, and then I say them and I'm like, it sounded better when I thought it. All right, so the example, of course, is from history. Because one of the things with history to do is to take it and use it as an example and to spur some sort of thought. So we see with this, the setup for the question is this. The historical events was, you see Vespasian's destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. This shift the influence of churches. So at that time, the church before 70 AD, the biggest, most influential church was the church in Jerusalem. After that, it becomes Ephesus and Antioch. Later, it would become Rome, Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, and Alexandria, Egypt. So the question is this. Now that all seemed to first happen because of tragedy, and then because of other factors like people moving and size of the churches. What, in your opinion, are the factors that make a church today kind of the more influential churches? And if you're doing this online, you can just answer it on the chat function. Anybody have any opinion? What makes some of the lead churches today kind of, are the more influential churches today, what makes them probably influential, you think?
The way they meet the needs of the people, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
In what ways? Like what needs?
If you had two churches side by side, you took one that was still in even the 60s, in that time frame, they met the needs of the people in a different way. You could tell the people back then, you aren't supposed to do it, and people would listen to it and do that, okay? Or at least feel guilty about not doing it. In today's world, you tell people not to do something, and you have to give them reason. You have to, you can't just say, this is the way it is. You have got to give more information behind it. Why?
Yeah.
What makes this so, don't tell me I can't do it, kind of stuff. So meeting the needs, you can't take the church that was back in the 60s, 70s, and put it in today's world, because that's the ones that are dying out with lack of people. You've got the ones that are meeting the needs of the people. They're feeding, they're growing, they're giving information, and information that was never shared back in the 60s, like evolution, the sexual things that is openly talked about from the pulpits. You've got two different kind of things. So that's what I meant.
Rebecca, what are your thoughts?
When you asked your question, my thoughts were looking culturally in the world today. I feel like a lot of things are right now. There's a big push in the millennial or younger generation for social justice, whatever that looks like. So if you find a church that is meeting, that is living up to their ideals of bringing social justice to this world, then I feel like there's a greater likelihood for people to say, hey, I can get in with that, and we're good. And so stuff like that, if you're talking about today, that's...
Which is what you said, that the people are liking the Church of Viera because of the outreach, because of the reaching out to the people around. That's social justice, right?
Yeah, which is like one of our things is our food bank, which I always like to advertise about. Is that we feed people. Brian,
I don't think it would really be any different on this era back here than said. it's the strength of the personality of the person moving that is carrying their philosophy of church to that region. You just, and different preachers have different philosophies and views, and through their strength and their pull, I mean, look at just not Jim Jones as an example of how he draws people, or you look at, T.D. Jakes, how they draw certain crowds. So, back then, who that leader was that dispersed to that area drew the crowd with him, and his philosophies and views built that church.
Yeah. Which is definitely an older way, and it's like Rebecca said with millennials, there's definitely a big shift
Very much.
from with Gen Xers and millennials, if you group those together, versus baby boomers
Yeah.
and the greatest generation,
Yeah.
the World War II veterans. Because what you get is from World War II through the 50s and 60s, you have people that were, pretty much everybody's grandfather or great-grandfather fought in World War II or had something to do with the military. So after World War II, you have a very command-centered, centralized command structure that everyone learned because so many people were in the military, and that probably continued on because you have a draft that continued on through the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. So it's kind of I would say for baby boomers, it is very natural for them to see, oh, this one personality, this leader, and everyone coming under them. And what you see now, because in my work we have to deal with this too, and a lot of companies are, is millennials and Gen Xers think a little, especially millennials, they think a little bit differently. They don't think in terms of command structure. They think in terms of collaboration. So it changes the way we do things. It changes work. It changes, it can change a lot of things.
It changes how you reach success, I feel like.
Yeah.
I mean, even during the discussion, I was thinking, I feel like the way that you attract is, the way that you, this is going to sound weird, but portray truth. And how you apply that, I think, is going, or what you present as truth, I guess, also can kind of determine who's going to follow.
Yeah, and that's the same as what they were doing there as they moved to build these churches. The different.
Yeah. Plus, you read in the olden days back during Peter and Paul when they were doing all their teachings, they went from word of mouth.
Yeah.
Where now, being a baby boomer and dealing with my grandchildren who are whatever you call them, they're in their 20s. I can't keep track of all the different generations.
Yeah.
But when a minister can go up there and declare that this is how Jesus wants us to live, and when they can recite scripture and you can see that it's written, then that gives people trust in that church and that they want to follow. And then as they get into the church, then they, encouraged to do community activities and to be more involved and feel like they're needed or wanted and just feel like they really want to be there. But I think it's being able to, now that we have the written scriptures, that we can follow that scripture to get the truth.
Yeah, and I agree with you about the written scriptures. It's just, and this is just, once again, my opinion, is that like there's been a shift too, because where before it was like everyone had some sort of experience with the Bible, whether you're Catholic or Protestant. Everyone seemed to know some of it or been exposed to church culture, where what's happened is we, for lack of a better terms, we have become a very secularized nation where you have people a large amount of people that have no experience with church and have no experience with religion. So, like with millennials, like Rebecca said, with social justice concept, the idea is like a lot of people now will volunteer or will like to say, okay, you're actually doing something. Oh, you're feeding. You have a food bank. You're feeding people.
Getting involved.
You're giving out backpacks to kids. So you're giving to the community, and from there it goes. Okay, why are you doing this? So where before it was you can, and like I became a Christian in Tennessee when I was 21, and I was used to high school, and in high school and college it was in Tennessee, and it was in the 90s, so it was like you still had the people that would come up to you and put the finger in your chest and go that you're doing it wrong, da 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 da, and you're like, I'm surprised I don't have a divot in my chest from that thing they do where it just pokes you, and that was fully acceptable. But now that just turns.
Oh
people
yeah,
off.
you definitely wouldn't do that
Yeah.
now. But
Nothing wrong
Yeah.
with it.
and you see, I came from a church that was kind of that way,
Uh-huh.
and I am so no man, don't even.
I feel like a lot of times nowadays, whereas before it might have been tell me the why and I'll do it versus I'll do the things and then you can tell me the why. I feel
Yeah.
like there's been kind of a shift in that too.
Yeah, which is what I was saying. You can't say you don't do this because.
Yeah.
You have to have the why.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. World, charismatic church, spiritual gifts. Sorry, I'm trying to figure out find where I want to pop in at. This is for this. So starting for this, get into it. We now talk about the shifts in churches. So at this point, at 100 AD, you now have Ephesus being a more influential church. Part of that being because it's a major city, it's a major port, but also you have the Apostle John by 100 AD, would have recently passed away.
Yeah.
He outlives all the other apostles. After he gets released from the island of Patmos, he gets dropped off at Ephesus because the Romans didn't know what to do. He was just really old, he was harmless. And from time to time he was carried around the city on a stretcher, and he would just say blessings over the people, and they'd put him away and let him go rest. So you now have this shift where the church leaders are people that knew John and would hear his story, and they would pass it along. Now, you also have, in the year 300, you have, or are we there yet? I'm lost, I'm sorry. Let's just start back and do session 2. Wait, there's Paul's secondary mission. Paul and Silas, that's not in the textbook. So I'll jump that. Then we'll go here. All right. So, you start to get these guys that are writing theology. They're taking scriptures, and at this point, the Bible is not composed yet. It's not composed until the Council of Nicaea under Constantine. Emperor Constantine was a Roman emperor who converts to Christianity in 300. That'll be a big kind of event in Christianity when we get to it. But what you get in between there is Rome's not really always persecuting the Christians. It seems to ebb and flow. So something will happen, the Christians will get under everybody's skin, they start feeding into the lions or other things, and then they kind of move on.
I thought it depended on the emperor that was
Yeah,
in charge.
it does, but it also depends on your city ruler. City rulers seem to have as much power
Okay.
as them, so it also can depend on your area. Even when Emperor Nero was in charge of Rome, and he's the one that takes out Paul and
Yeah,
Peter.
he was, yeah.
Yeah, if you're in the city of Rome and you're a Christian, when Nero's in charge, you're definitely a target.
Mhm.
If you're on the further reaches of the empire,
Mhm.
not Jerusalem, you may not be a target. Because you're just like, if everything's settled, the local magistrate isn't asking for the Roman troops to come, then you're kind of just left alone. Let's see. All right, so 2nd century, that's 180 to 280. This is when you get from 100 to 160 to 165. You get Justin Martyr. He is an apologist from the 2nd century. He wrote and spoke to defend Christianity and its gifts.
What's apologist?
Oh,
Apologist.
defending Christianity.
Oh,
And
defense.
defending it in the way of using Scripture to prove that God's real, using Scripture to prove the Christian worldview, which we'll talk about some in the New Testament cultures class. Because what you get with Christianity is a shift in culture, in the way they see marriage, in the way they see, the treatment of people, in the way they see the treatment of women and children. So they say the gifts are present in men and women during this time. The book does a good job of pointing these things out.
Right.
Throughout the time period after Acts, so after Acts, after the last apostle John had passed away, you still see outbreaks of the spiritual gifts. And you also
Right.
see them in both men and women.
Right.
You also have men and women in the early church taking leadership roles. So, yeah. Why do you look surprised about it?
No, I'm
Yeah.
just playing along.
Okay. Thanks for
I'm
playing along.
because it's fun because it's still fun to hear it. Afresh to sit back because sometimes it's stuff that but like I've had this class before, so it's stuff that is in the back of my mind, but it's not stuff that I think about 24/7.
Yeah.
So to hear it again brings it to the forefront of like, oh yeah, wait a
Yeah.
second. Like you think about the impact is. If you've been brought up in the church a while or you've been taking classes even at ECCU for a while, to know that like, yeah, women were in leadership roles, that you kind of know in your head, but to
Yeah.
think about and realize how counterculture that was, sometimes that's the piece you don't think about.
Yeah.
So that's where hearing it again is like, oh yeah, that was crazy for them back
Yeah.
then, because you're used to it now. You're
Yeah.
used to it today.
Yeah, and just to remind everybody, like you said, like the attitude of women the attitude that society had on women in the Roman and Greek culture, or any culture within that sphere in the Middle East, was women, like in Greek culture, women weren't allowed to own property. Women were not considered somewhat equals, like they couldn't hold certain positions. The one thing that, well, the two things, but they were kind of related in the polytheistic religion, was when you did have women becoming priestesses. And the other thing with that too is that a lot of them were temple prostitutes. So you have this kind of break in culture, especially when you have like things like Paul in his writings saying, to treat women a certain way and to not treat them in this way. I guess I'll go off on a tangent. So in 1 Corinthians, when Paul says women stay silent, he's saying it in Corinth, which has, of course, an oracle temple. The oracles were women. And there were temple prostitutes, both men and women. And what he's talking about, in my mind, this is my opinion, is that he's telling the Church of Corinth that has to deal with converts going to maybe the Christian church in Corinth, but then also having the pressure of society saying this is acceptable, saying that look, women need to cover themselves because that's not what we do here. That's not why the women are in the church. To put it kind of without being too blunt. So that's just my take on part of that. Anyway, so Martyr, let's get back to him. He, of course, is talking about the prophetic gift, the Holy Spirit in action. You see casting out of demons and healing ministry. Actually, it's interesting. If you talk to missionaries, and this is what we bring up a lot in the class, is kind of tracking spiritual gifts, tracking the charismatic movement. Outside of the United States, people still have demons cast out. People still see a lot of major healings. It seems to be something maybe in our mindset, how we view things. You know.
Sad.
Oh yeah, yeah. I was talking to one of these missionaries I know that are that are on furlough, and they're telling me about the spirit of distraction. And they're like, oh yeah, we get spirits of distraction all the time in meetings in Africa. I'm like, well, what is that? And they just come into the meeting and just yell. And I'm like, oh. Or they do something to get everyone's attention. Which gives you a different viewpoint.
Right.
Because like I was at a worship service here, and somebody does something and you're like, oh, spirit of distraction, where before I would be like, my thought process would be like, what's with this jerk? It's annoying, but you kind of realize the game. All right. Irenaeus, he is the bishop of Lyons. Lyons is a city. He's another guy. He's in the first chapter of the book. He is a student of Polycarp. Polycarp is the bishop of Ephesus. So Polycarp is not talked about in your book, but he is important for this reason. He is the bishop of Ephesus, which means he takes over, he's in charge of the church at Ephesus while John's still alive, the Apostle John. And he is the leader of the church in Ephesus. So he is one of these early, like after the church disciples, 2nd century church leaders. Polycarp is actually put on trial in Ephesus. It's one of the times that the rulers of the city get a little agitated at the Christians, and they start to look for him and arrest him. A lot of Christians scatter. Polycarp is caught, and I don't really know how much he tried to hide. I think they caught him at his house. He was put in in one of the Roman forums for a trial. So he was out there in trial in front of the city, kind of like how Paul was put out in Acts in Ephesus, where he's just put out there and he had to talk. In the middle of it, though, of course, when they catch you, they give you an option. The option is, of course, renounce Christ, or they're going to kill you. Here's the interesting thing about what they accuse Christians of when they put them on trial during this time. They are put on trial for atheism. Because remember, different time, different mindset. The atheism that Christians are accused of is not believing in all the Roman and Greek gods. Which to a Roman is going to be unpatriotic. Because remember, you want to keep all the gods happy. If everyone's not paying respect to all these gods, Rome is not going to be the best it's going to be. And they also have emperor worship. So if you don't believe the emperor is a god, well, that's atheism, and that's unpatriotic. We can't have that.
So die.
Yeah. Polycarp's response was, when they accused him of atheism, he's turning around. So as he's standing, he's turning around, and he's a very old man, and he's pointing to people in the crowd, and he's calling them atheist.
Is he the one they boiled?
Yes, he's one of the ones that boiled. They boiled John, too, supposedly. They also poisoned John.
Oh, let's poison you and boil you too.
Yeah, yeah. So Polycarp,
Because when you said he was real old, I remembered that.
yeah, he was killed for basically not renouncing Christ. or not basically, he was, that was always,
Yeah, he was very, very strong in his words and what he proclaimed of Christ. He was very, very firm.
yeah. And even so that he's, I mean, just think about this as an older gentleman staying in front of a crowd of a city booing him, and he's calling them the atheist, and then he's put to death for it. Other issue that Irenaeus writes against, and you see this with the writings of Paul, but you see Paul writing against these people too, but they don't have a name. And then you see their names show up in the 2nd century. It's the Gnostics. The Gnostics are a group that are, they claim to be part of Christianity, but their beliefs were not Christian.
Right.
They had some very specifically strange views. They believed that Christ didn't die. He was actually always on earth as a spirit and never came in the flesh. So he was never truly crucified, and that's how he lived. They
Right.
also had this this logic that was circular logic that you hear Paul kind of talk against in some of his writings, but you also see here Irenaeus and some of the other early church fathers of the 2nd century write against. And it was this logic. God gives grace to the sinner. So to experience God's grace and to increase your experience in God's grace, you need to sin more so God can forgive you. Because the more you sin, the more you'll get God's grace. And yeah,
I remember reading that.
they had so they had these kind of views. They also there are gospels out there. They're considered, people call them gospels, the Gnostic gospels about Jesus, and they were the Gnostic writings about Jesus. They are not in the Bible for a reason. They weren't written by eyewitnesses. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we know are written by eyewitnesses. John, Matthew, Mark. Luke is writing down Peter, the Apostle Peter's story. But with the Gnostic Gospels, they're, my favorite, not favorite to read, but just the concept is funny, is the Gospel of Judas. Yeah, the most popular one is the Gospel of Thomas, but the Gospel of Judas is the one that just makes me giggle, because his whole concept is that in it, Judas says that he didn't betray Jesus. It was actually a deal that him and Jesus worked out, so that way he would. Yeah, I know.
Oh gosh.
Yeah. It was all just a misunderstanding.
Good one, Judas.
They're not in, that isn't part of the Apocrypha?
No, they're not part of the Apocrypha. The
Okay.
Apocrypha is Old Testament writings
Uh-huh.
that came about during the time of when the Greeks, Alexander the Great, conquered Jerusalem and basically most of the world. But those were written during that time. There's also it records the Maccabean revolt, which was the Jewish
Right.
revolt against the
Right.
Greeks, the Greek rulers, the Seleucids. Seleucids, I can't remember how to say it right. All right, so Tertullian. Now, as we go, these guys with some of the more liturgical churches, they quote some of these writers, but they never mention kind of their kind of charismatic mentionings that they have in their writings. He is fluent in Greek, Latin. He is a law and philosophic systems. He is another apologist from the Western Church. According to his writing, spiritual gifts are kind of the norm.
Mm-hmm.
Sam, have you read any of these guys'
Uh,
works?
I've read quotes.
Is it difficult to read?
Yes.
And
Yes. Yes.
I can imagine.
Yeah. I've tried to read. One I tried to read was John of the Cross.
Mm-hmm.
He has this book. He's one of the early writers. He had a book titled "The Dark Night of the Soul." It's really thick. If you have problems sleeping, I suggest you read it.
Yeah.
Which is something to bring up. Is that like there are people who are really good at reading that and understanding it.
Yeah.
And their job is to take it and update it and pass whatever wisdom there is there to go on. But for the average person, it's really hard to go through and read. And like for me, I have to read kind of slow. I have to read it kind of slowly, and they use a lot of words. Plus, too, you got to realize our attention span as humans has changed. I think studies now show like these people didn't have TV, they didn't have any entertainment,
Right.
so of course like a 600-page book sounds awesome.
Yeah.
To read at night. So you just read it every night because you don't have TV or Facebook or any social media. So the effect it has on us is our idea of what intelligence is, but also our attention span. Back then, the idea of intelligence was you can memorize large amounts of information and repeat it. To us, it's problem solving. And their attention span was probably a lot longer. For us, they say it's your age divided by 2.
What? Minutes?
Well,
seconds?
however many minutes your attention span is. So
Huh.
yeah, so like me, I'm 43, so you could probably only keep me interested for like 22 minutes, 22 and a half, and then after that you have to like switch. Which and you think about it for like a 15-year-old,
Yeah.
that's even you got 7 minutes, and then you have them having to do something, then you have to switch gears or switch tasks because they're over it. Yeah. All right. Novatian, he is a 3rd century guy. He is the presbyter of the Church of Rome. This is a term used in early Christian church. Presbyter, this is where we get the denomination's name, Presbyterian.
Do you mean to skip that origin?
Oh, did I skip him?
Yeah.
My bad. Sorry. Sorry. Brian got me off topic.
Oh, sorry.
He always does.
Yep,
All right.
that's Brian.
He's a writer and leader of a Christian school. What you find with a lot of these guys too is they do set up schools. In the Greek tradition, from the Greek philosophers, they would do that. If you were a popular philosophical Greek scholar, you would have a school so people can learn your way, and that's kind of carried on into the Christian church. He sets up the first systematic theology, which is just a way to learn theology. You learn this, then you learn that, then you learn this. He, though, has this interesting thing. He is the first one to indicate, Origen, he's the first one to indicate that the spiritual gifts, the Christian spiritual supernatural ministry and activities were becoming less common. This is also too, for someone who believes that the spiritual gifts died off with the apostles, you're looking at around the year 200. So you're looking at like 100 or so years after the last apostle died. There is a theology out there in Protestant churches, and I'm not sure if the Catholic Church uses it or not, but their whole belief is that the supernatural spiritual gifts died out with the apostles because we don't need them anymore, because we have the
That was
Holy Bible.
coming around when the churches got involved and,
Yeah,
according to
Yeah.
what the book was talking about.
yeah. So for them, Origen's writing proves it to you because the argument is, of course, you have a guy who is writing about over 100 years after the apostles, indicating that spiritual gifts are dying off. But please remember that is just in his area of the world. And we don't know enough about what was going on in his church, in his region. Because we do know that spiritual gifts seem to be more about, seem to flow more in areas where it is taught, where people are accepting of them, and where people seem to push into them. Novation, he of course is somewhat the same time period as Origen. This is where we get the, like I said, this is where we get the word Presbyterian. It is an office bearer who exercise teaching and administrative functions. So the idea of like the Presbyterian church is that it's supposed to be a place to teach the Bible. He seems to be a very well-respected theologian from his time. I'm moving this so I can see my notes. All right. So Novation believes that there was too much leniency for backsliding Christians due to persecution. Which will lead us to our next question for the next session, because we have 2 minutes, so I'll let y'all think about this. What you find with the 2nd century church, so here's the setup for the question. What you find from the 2nd century church is that the Romans persecuting the Christians, you would see 2 reactions from the Christians, or actually 3. They would run for their lives, they would get caught, and when they're caught, they would not deny Christ, and by not denying Christ, they're tortured and killed. But that's not the story with all of them. Some of them, when put in that pressure, deny Christ and renounce Christ. That's actually what they're asked to do. So they publicly renounce Christ, but then they come back, try to come back into the church. So your question when we get back will be, what would you do with those people? It's a good question. All right, we'll discuss that when we get back from break.